Most bourbon legends built a brand, but one family helped build an industry. They survived wars, economic collapse, prohibition, and wave after wave of ownership changes. And for more than 2 centuries, the Beam name has remained woven into the story of American whiskey. Not because they always owned a distillery, but because generation after generation kept making bourbon. In doing so, they became bourbon royalty. This is the story of the family that may have influenced American whiskey more than any other. Welcome to Sticks and Spirits, and this is Men Behind the Bottle. Today, we're talking about the family that became bourbon's first dynasty, the Beams. The Beam story begins before bourbon was even bourbon, before famous distilleries, before rickhouses, before brands, and before labels. It begins with a farmer. In the late 1700s, a German-American farmer named Johann Jacob Beam settled in Kentucky. Like most frontier families, he grew corn. And like many Kentucky farmers, he discovered that while corn was valuable, whiskey was even more valuable. A wagon loaded with grain was bulky and difficult to move. A barrel of whiskey was easier to transport, easier to trade, and less likely to spoil. Family records indicate that around 1795, Jacob Beam sold his first barrel of whiskey. It may not have looked remarkable at the time, but it would become one of the foundational moments in American whiskey history. What Jacob Beam started wasn't simply a distillery. It was a family tradition, a craft, and a way of life. And unlike most family businesses, it wouldn't last for just a generation or two. It would last for centuries. Generation after generation, the knowledge was passed down. Jacob Beam, David M. Beam, and eventually James Beauregard Beam, the man the world would come to know as Jim Beam. Each generation inherited more than recipes. They inherited responsibility. The responsibility to keep the whiskey flowing and to protect the family name. By the early 1900s, it seemed like the Beam family had built something that would last forever. Then came Prohibition. In 1920, Prohibition became law, and the manufacture and sale of alcohol became illegal. For many distilleries, it was a death sentence. Some shut their doors forever. Others sold their equipment. Entire whiskey companies vanished from history. Prohibition shut down the Beam family's whiskey-making business and forced the family out of distilling for more than a decade. Production stopped, the stills went silent, and for the first time in more than a century, the Beam family was no longer making whiskey. Now, Jim Beam wasn't a wealthy executive who could simply retire into comfort. He went to work. He farmed, he mined, and he did whatever he had to do to support his family. But he never stopped believing bourbon would return. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being nearly 70 years old, your distilling career wiped away, your profession outlawed, and 13 years gone without making whiskey. Most people would have called it a career. Jim Beam started over. When Prohibition ended in 1933, he got back to work immediately. Family and brand lore hold that he rebuilt the distillery in just 120 days. Whether that number is exact or not, the point remains the same. The Beams were not finished, not even close. And Jim Beam wasn't leading from behind a desk. Perhaps nothing symbolizes his legacy better than something most people never see: yeast. Every bourbon distillery has a mash bill: corn, rye or wheat, malted barley. But many distillers will tell you the real personality of a bourbon comes from the yeast. The Beam family understood that. For generations, they carefully protected their proprietary yeast culture, treating it as one of the company's most valuable assets. Brand and family lore say Jim Beam recreated the family yeast culture as Prohibition ended and guarded it closely. Because barrels can be replaced, buildings can be rebuilt, and equipment can be upgraded. But once a unique yeast strain is lost, part of the whiskey's identity disappears forever. At the distillery, Jim Beam's Cadillac has become part of the brand's storytelling about these rebuilding years. There's even a jug in the front seat representing the yeast that he would bring home every weekend for safekeeping. The Jim Beam brand grew rapidly in the decades that followed and became one of the most recognizable names in American whiskey. But success would bring a new challenge. And here's what many bourbon fans don't realize. For much of the modern era, the Beam family has influenced the whiskey more than they have controlled the company. Ownership changed. Businesses merged. Investors came and went. Public companies acquired brands. Over time, the company passed through multiple ownership changes before ultimately becoming part of what is now Beam Suntory, which today operates as Suntory Global Spirits. And yet the Beam family never disappeared, even as ownership changed. And yet the Beam family never disappeared. Even as ownership changed hands, the people making the whiskey have always remained Beams. The family stayed connected to the craft, teaching the next generation, protecting traditions, and serving as ambassadors for bourbon itself. Most family businesses who lose control just fade away. The Beams lost control and somehow became even more influential. And maybe that's the perfect metaphor for the Beam family. While ownership, distilleries, and market changed, the knowledge just kept getting passed down, like the yeast. And something else was happening at the same time. Because while most whiskey families built a distillery, the Beams built distillers. Most bourbon fans think the Beam story ends with Jim Beam. It doesn't. In many ways, that's where it truly begins. As the Jim Beam brand was growing, members of the family began appearing throughout Kentucky bourbon. Their fingerprints were everywhere. At Heaven Hill, Parker Beam became one of the most respected master distillers of the modern era. His influence was so significant that one of Heaven Hill's most celebrated annual releases now bears his name, Parker's Heritage Collection. Then came Craig Beam, another master distiller, and another key figure at Heaven Hill. At Limestone Branch Distillery, Steve Beam helped revive Yellowstone bourbon, with his brother Paul joining him. It was just another branch of the family tree continuing the tradition. Then back at Beam itself, there was Booker No, Jim Beam's grandson, and perhaps the most famous Beam after Jim himself. Long before barrel-proof bourbon became fashionable, Booker was bottling whiskey exactly how he liked to drink it: big, bold, uncut, and unfiltered. His influence helped launch the modern bourbon renaissance. Then came Fred No. After Fred came Freddie No. 8 generations after Jim Beam sold that first barrel of whiskey, a Beam has still helped shaping American bourbon. At some point, the family stopped being associated with a single distillery and became associated with an entire industry. Jack Daniel left the distillery. George Remus left the legend. William LaRue Weller left an idea. The Beams left the dynasty. It is a dynasty that stretches across Kentucky bourbon. Jim Beam, Booker's, Knobs Creek, Heaven Hill, Yellowstone, and countless whiskey makers who learned from generations of Beam distillers. For more than 2 centuries, the Beam family has handed down recipes, techniques, traditions, and even a yeast strain. One generation teaching the next, one distiller mentoring another, one family helping shape American bourbon. Most bourbon families produce a generation or two of whiskey makers. The Beams produced generations of generations. At some point, the family stopped being known for a company and became known for a craft. Not many families can claim to have helped build an industry. The Beams can. For today's bourbon, we're honoring bourbon's first family. The bourbon is Booker's, a whiskey that reflects the bold personality of Booker No. And the cigar is a 1964 Padron Anniversary Series, another family-built legacy brand that has spent generations pursuing quality over quantity. Together, they create a pairing built on heritage, craftsmanship, tradition, and family. For more than 2 centuries, their family has appeared again and again throughout Kentucky bourbon, not because they owned the industry, but because they helped teach it. And that may be the greatest legacy any bourbon family has ever left behind. Next time on Men Behind the Bottle, we meet the man whose name became one of the most famous in bourbon collecting, the man whose family would become eventually intertwined with Sazerac and Buffalo Trace, Pappy Van Winkle. Till next time, keep your sticks lit, keep your spirits high, and cheers.